December 7th, 1941. Battleship Row, Pearl Harbor. The morning was so calm, so ordinary, that no one aboard USS West Virginia could have guessed their world would end in minutes. The Pacific sun had just crept over the Koʻolau Range, painting the harbor in that sleepy gold of early morning. Some men were still finishing breakfast. Others, like boatswain's mate first class Clifford Olds, were already on deck, wiping down the railings, thinking about the Liberty hours that afternoon. Then, at 7:55 a.m., the sky screamed. From the north came the first wave. Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, their engines roaring low over Ford Island. In seconds, the air was filled with the wail of sirens, the thud of explosions, and the shriek of metal tearing apart. West Virginia, anchored outboard of Tennessee, was one of the first to be struck. The first torpedo slammed into her port side, shuddering through the steel hull like a hammer blow. Then another, and another. 7 torpedoes in total. She began to list immediately. Men were thrown from their stations. Compartments flooded in seconds. The crew struggled to counter flood, to keep her upright. But the sea was pouring in faster than they could pump it out. On deck, chaos reigned. The air was thick with black smoke and the smell of burning oil. Machine gun fire rattled from above as Japanese Zeros strafed the men trying to abandon ship. Captain Mervyn Bennion, commanding officer of the West Virginia, was mortally wounded when a bomb fragment struck him on the bridge. Yet, even as blood ran down his face, he kept shouting orders to save his ship. By 8:10 a.m., flames leapt from the water around West Virginia. Oil from ruptured tanks floated to the surface and ignited, trapping sailors in a ring of fire. Men dove overboard, clothes aflame, their screams merging with the distant hum of engines overhead. In the midst of it all, Chief Petty Officer Dallas Hyatt remembered thinking it felt like the end of the world. The ship groaned, her great body settling into the mud below. Her mast tilted, her guns silent. When the attack finally ended, the once proud battleship lay half-submerged, her superstructure twisted and blackened, the stars and stripes still fluttering above her in defiance. She would remain there for months, silent, gutted, and entombed. Below decks, trapped sailors tapped desperately on the hull for 3 days before the sound stopped. To the casual eye, West Virginia was dead. But deep in the Navy's salvage yards, in the minds of a few engineers and divers, a defiant thought began to grow. What if she could live again? January 1942. Pearl Harbor's once busy waters had turned into a graveyard. Oil slicks shimmered on the surface, the stench of burned fuel lingering in the humid air. The wreckage of 7 great ships loomed like dark monuments, twisted, silent, and half buried in silt. Amid them, USS West Virginia lay on her side in 12 meters of muddy water, her superstructure mangled, decks shattered, hull torn open along the port side. Divers called her Wee V, but she looked more like a ghost than a ship. Lieutenant Commander Harold Swede Larson of the Navy Salvage Division stood on a barge beside her one morning, looking down at what was left. He'd served on battleships his whole career, but this was different. The West Virginia wasn't just damaged, she was drowned. And yet, the order from Admiral Nimitz was clear. Raise her. The job fell to a small, tight-knit team of naval engineers, welders, and divers. Men who would spend the next 8 months in darkness, danger, and stench beyond imagining. They were led by Commander Homer N. Wallen, head of the Pearl Harbor salvage operation. A man with a calm voice, clear eyes, and an engineer's stubborn faith in physics. Their first task was to make the ship safe enough to enter. Inside, Compartments were flooded with oil, bodies still trapped within. Divers wore heavy Mark V suits and brass helmets, descending into black water so thick with oil it coated their faceplates. They could not see their hands in front of them. Every motion was by touch. One diver later wrote, "You don't breathe air in there, you breathe oil." Over the next weeks, they sealed compartments, patched holes, and rigged pumps to expel the water. Some of the patches were improvised from scrap steel, welded in awkward angles by men hanging upside down in flooded spaces. Every time a patch held, they cheered. Every time one failed, it flooded another compartment. When the oil finally began to drain, the salvage crew made a grim discovery. In compartment after compartment, they found the remains of sailors who had survived the blast, only to suffocate as the oxygen ran out. In one section, they found a calendar marked to December 23rd, 16 days after the attack. The men inside had lasted that long. Word spread through the harbor, and even the toughest divers went quiet. From then on, no one called West Virginia the wreck. They called her the ship. By March, they had pumped out most of the water. The ship's hull, though ruptured and distorted, began to rise slightly. The cranes groaned, cables straining. On May 17, 1942, under a blazing Hawaiian sun, West Virginia broke the surface, her deck glistening with black oil, her mast rising once again above the waterline. She had come back from the dead. But the work was only beginning. To make her fight again, they would have to rebuild her from the keel up. June 1942. The wrecked hull of West Virginia now rested in dry dock number 1 at Pearl Harbor. Her guns were silent, her decks stripped, and her interior still slick with oil and memory. Yet to Commander Homer Wallen and his crew, this was no grave. It was a workshop of resurrection. Everywhere, sparks danced. Torches hissed, hammers rang against steel. The air was thick with the smell of salt, rust, and burning metal. The salvage gang, a mix of Navy men, civilian shipyard workers, and Seabees, worked 12-hour shifts under blistering Hawaiian heat. Many had already raised other ships, Nevada, California, Oglala, but Wee was something else entirely. She had taken 7 torpedoes. Her hull was bent inward like crushed tin. The lower decks looked like a labyrinth of collapsed bulkheads and twisted piping. The engineers debated whether she could ever fight again. Some said scrap her. But Wallen had other plans. He didn't just want her afloat, he wanted her reborn. First, the pumps roared to life. A thunder that echoed through the dry dock as the last of the seawater poured from her belly. Then came the cutting crews, slicing open rusted doors, prying apart jammed hatches, removing every burned wire and shattered gauge. They cataloged everything salvageable. Even the brass fittings were saved, polished, and labeled. Down below, welders crawled through manholes no larger than a kitchen window, patching each puncture one by one. The work was brutal. Temperatures inside the hull reached 130 degrees. Oxygen was scarce. Men worked by floodlight, sweat streaking through soot. Yet when asked why they kept going, one petty officer said simply, "Because she's ours." By September, her hull was watertight again. Her engines were stripped down to their bolts. The engineers replaced her burned-out electrical systems with new circuits, rewired her entire communications network, and fitted new radar arrays. A technology that hadn't even existed when she was first launched in 1921. The shipyard gave her a new heart, 8 Babcock & Wilcox boilers, and 4 new turbines. She was stronger, faster, and more modern than she had ever been. Above deck, her superstructure was redesigned entirely. New fire control towers, dual-purpose 5-inch guns, and dozens of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft cannons. They rebuilt her with the lessons of Pearl Harbor etched into every rivet. By late 1943, she was nearly ready. Her decks gleamed with fresh paint. Her crew, many of them veterans who had escaped her death that December morning, returned to man their stations once again. They stood quietly as the ship's bell was reinstalled, the same bell that had rung the call to battle 2 years before. When West Virginia finally left Pearl Harbor under her own power on July 17, 1944, the harbor workers lined the docks. Many removed their caps. Some saluted. From the pier, Commander Wallen watched her glide past the still sunken remains of Arizona. He whispered, "Welcome back, old girl." She was no longer a relic. She was a survivor, a phoenix forged in oil, fire, and iron. October 20th, 1944. Dawn over Leyte Gulf, Philippines. The horizon burned red with the reflection of 1,000 gun flashes. For the men aboard USS West Virginia, the sound was both familiar and foreign. Familiar because it was war again. Foreign because this time they were the ones firing back. It had been nearly 3 years since she sank in the mud of Pearl Harbor. Now she steamed proudly at the head of Battleship Division 4. Her guns polished, her decks alive with energy, her crews steady at their stations. The air was electric with tension. Across the fleet intercom, the calm voice of Captain Boyd C. Buzz. Brown echoed, "Gunnery crews, stand by. We have waited for this." At 4:52 a.m., radar picked up a blip, then another and another. Japanese ships moving fast through the narrow straits off Samar. The Imperial Navy had launched a desperate counterattack to repel the American landings at Leyte. The old battleships, West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania, were the last wall between the Japanese fleet and the vulnerable troop transports ashore. West Virginia's radar fire control team went to work, hands flying across the dials of the Mark 8 radar set. The system, a marvel of post-Pearl Harbor engineering, gave them what no American battleship had ever had before: the ability to fire accurately through the dark without visual contact. At 4:55 a.m., Captain Brown gave the order. Commence firing. The first salvo thundered through the morning stillness. The 16-inch guns of West Virginia roared, hurling 1-ton shells over 20 miles into the blackness. The recoil rattled every deck. The crew felt the ship tremble as though remembering her own rebirth. Within seconds, the other battleships joined in, lighting up the sky with fire and sound that shook the very sea. It was the Battle of Surigao Strait, the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. And West Virginia fired the first shot. For nearly half an hour, she rained destruction with machine precision. Her radar-directed salvos landed so accurately that her shells tore through the Japanese battleship Yamashiro before the enemy even saw her silhouette. Destroyers and torpedo boats darted through the gaps, adding to the chaos. The night became a storm of explosions and tracer fire. By dawn, it was over. Yamashiro was sinking, her decks aflame. The rest of the Japanese southern force was in retreat or destroyed. The sea was calm again, except for the oil fires drifting in the current. As the smoke cleared, Captain Brown stood on the bridge and watched the horizon. The men around him were silent. For them, it wasn't just victory. It was vindication. The West Virginia, the ship that had been left for dead in 1941, had returned to fire the first salvo in the last great naval gun battle of the Pacific. Later, one sailor wrote in his diary, She rose from her own grave to fight again. I swear I could feel her heartbeat under my boots. From that day on, West Virginia was more than a ship. She was a legend, living proof that steel, when forged with will, could carry a soul. But her journey wasn't over yet. Ahead lay Okinawa and the new face of war. April 1st, 1945. Off Okinawa. The sea rolled in a gray haze. Rain fell in thin needles, tracing the outlines of destroyers and carriers as far as the eye could see. This was Operation Iceberg, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. And USS West Virginia was once again in the thick of it. She had come far since that December morning in 1941. Her hull was rebuilt, her guns rebored, her bridge unrecognizable. But below deck, amid the hum of engines and the smell of hot oil, there were still men who had survived Pearl Harbor. Men who remembered the fire, the screams, the taste of smoke. Now they stood ready again, silent at their stations, watching the radar screens for what the Navy called special attack units, kamikazes. By this stage of the war, the Japanese had turned desperation into doctrine. Dozens of planes hurled themselves at the American fleet each day. For battleships like West Virginia, it was not a question of if they'd be attacked, but when. At 3:10 p.m., the radar alarm shrieked. "Incoming bandits, 9 o'clock high." The gunners didn't hesitate. The sky exploded with tracers as her 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons filled the air with flak. The gun crews had trained for this, fast, furious, relentless. But one enemy plane broke through the smoke, diving low, its engine howling like an animal. "Take him down! Take him down!" someone shouted. The kamikaze slammed into the ship's port side, just above the waterline, carving a fiery wound in her hull. The explosion tore through compartments and sent shrapnel flying across the deck. Men were thrown to the ground. For a moment, all sound disappeared, except the ringing in their ears and the hiss of steam. Then, movement. Orders, fire hoses, medics, damage control crews raced to seal bulkheads to contain the flames. Within 20 minutes, they had the fire under control. Within an hour, they had power restored to the aft turrets. When the smoke cleared, West Virginia still held formation. Her guns were ready. Her flag still flew. 30 sailors had been wounded, 4 killed, but she stayed in the fight. Over the next month, she continued her bombardment of Okinawa, shelling Japanese positions day after day. Her big guns thundered so continuously that crewmen stuffed cotton in their ears and taped the seams of their helmets. At night, the sea around her glowed with phosphorus, reflecting the light of distant fires on shore. By June, the island was secure. The cost, for everyone, was beyond measure. But the West Virginia had survived again. When word came of Japan's surrender that August, the ship was anchored in Buckner Bay. Her crew gathered on deck as the radio broadcast the news. Some cheered, some wept. Others simply stared at the horizon, too tired, too changed to feel anything at all. Boatswain's mate Clifford Olds, the same man who'd stood on her deck that December morning 4 years before, walked to the rail and looked down at the Pacific waters. "We did it," he whispered. The ship that had died at Pearl Harbor had outlived the war itself. Later that year, West Virginia steamed into Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremony. Her guns were silent, her deck spotless, her flag bright in the wind. Among the fleet surrounding her were ships that had once been written off: California, Nevada, Tennessee. But none had fallen as far or risen as completely as West Virginia. On September 1945, as the Japanese delegation signed the instrument of surrender aboard USS Missouri, a quiet murmur passed among her crew. She made it. And somewhere beneath the hum of machinery and the whisper of the waves, it almost felt like Weevee herself was breathing again. The deep, steady breath of a survivor who had finally come home.